My name is Hanne Larsen, and during this lecture I'll give you some background information about culture and intercultural communication in a business context. You will learn about the concepts of culture, cultural value dimensions, the effects of culture on behavior and communication, and how to develop an intercultural competence strategy. You may ask yourself whether it pays off to focus on intercultural communication. Well, I'd like to read this case aloud for you. A medium-sized Danish company employed a highly skilled Chinese scientist. He often had disputes with the Danish middle manager. The Chinese didn't feel respected and acknowledged. The Danish middle manager, however, found that the Chinese was not a team player, that he kept knowledge to himself and failed to meet agreements. In the end, the Chinese employee returned to China. He took with him product knowledge, which today he utilizes to develop competitive products. As you'll see from this example taken from a Danish company, it may have a negative impact on profits and competitiveness if we don't pay attention to cultural differences and intercultural communication aspects when interacting with people from other cultures. Please consider for a moment, what is culture to you? What cultural differences do you experience at work? Now let's go on to talking about what makes up culture. Culture is made up of the norms, values and attitudes that are transmitted from generation to generation through, for instance, family, history, religion, language and social institutions. The culture that we share as a group gives us guidelines and structure to our lives, and so it provides identity and gives us a sense of belonging. The iceberg metaphor is often used to describe national culture. Only 1/10 of the iceberg is above the waterline, and this reminds us that only a small proportion of cultural aspects are visible. Even though most of who we are is below the surface, we tend to make assumptions based on the tip of the iceberg, the visible portion, which often results in misjudgments. If we want to get to really know someone, we need to look below the surface and learn about the thoughts, values and assumptions of that particular culture. In fact, the aspects below the surface will directly influence those on the tip of the iceberg. For example, religious beliefs influence holiday customs, and notions of beauty influence the arts. The most familiar way of thinking about a cultural group is as a national culture. And understanding differences between one national culture and another is a good starting point for developing cultural competences. But merely describing personal preferences and behaviors as cultural behavior is one of the most consistent errors made by people during cross-cultural interactions. What we must remember too is that actions and thoughts cannot always be explained by national cultural values and norms, as there are many subcultures that affect our attitudes and behavior. Besides, the universal values or the things we share with almost every human being also shape our behavior. For example, the concept of family. At the deepest level of the iceberg are our individual differences and personalities, which also have a great impact on our actions. What does it then mean to be interculturally competent? Well, intercultural competence is the capability to function effectively across national, ethnic and organizational cultures. It's a four-dimensional model, starting with yourself. This means that before studying other cultures, you need to develop cultural self-awareness. This topic will be dealt with in a separate lecture. Next, you must study other cultures, norms and values, and understand the way culture shapes thinking and behavior. The objective of acquiring this understanding is not to become like the people in that cultural group. The goal is to understand and appreciate the rules behind their lives and society. Cultural competences begin with simply understanding the powerful role of culture in ourselves and others. The third important element in developing intercultural competences is to become aware of similarities and differences between your own and other cultures' verbal and non-verbal communication styles, so that you can customize and personalize your behavior. The fourth and most important element, the action part, means that based on your knowledge and skills, you're capable of putting it all together by developing an appropriate communication strategy that gets the message across without losing yourself in the process. Many scholars have tried to measure and categorize cultures, which is also possible to some extent. In recent years, they've been criticized for taking a simplistic view on culture at the risk of stereotyping. But on the other hand, they provide a useful basis for further cultural studies. This lecture is based on the theories and value dimensions of well-known theorists such as Hofstede, Hall and Trompenaars, as they provide a useful basis for understanding culture. In the following slides, I'll describe culture by means of such value dimensions. However, we must keep in mind that an awareness of cultural values is not a substitute for more direct knowledge of person-to-person encounters. For instance, a person belonging to a group-oriented culture may enjoy working on a team assignment. To sum up, I'd like to say that cultural knowledge is a useful starting point for cultural thinking, but it is only a starting point. It cannot stand alone, and my aim has been to take a more complex view by adding further aspects and recommendations as we go along. The first value dimension that I'll describe gives the opposites between individualist and collectivist cultures. As you'll see, individualist cultures emphasize individual identity. This means that they prefer individual decisions and working alone. Individualist cultures are largely governed by a commitment to do what's best for the individual, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of other individuals. Individualist cultures also tend to value direct feedback and to express their opinion directly. Some examples of individualist cultures are Scandinavia, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, and Anglo-Saxon countries. In contrast, collectivist cultures are usually places where saving face is of high value. Harmony must be preserved and confrontation avoided out of fear of losing face or feeling shame. Collectivist cultures emphasize dedication and loyalty to the group, including, for instance, the family, an organization or a tribe. They prefer group decisions and working with others. Collectivist cultures give a high degree of loyalty to their employer, and in turn expect support and loyalty back from the company. Some examples of collectivist cultures are South Korea, Brazil, China, India, Japan, and the Middle East. It's important to remember that many of the individuals that we meet do not seem to fit the standard profile for their culture. For instance, China has long been regarded as a highly group-oriented culture, but there are big contrasts between generations. Young Chinese employees are often referred to as little emperors, who, as a result of China's one-child policy, have been raised by 6 adults, their own parents plus 2 sets of grandparents, and so they never had to compromise with or take care of their siblings. They are often described as the most independent, or some might say selfish, generation in China's history, and both foreign and domestic employers in China comment that this attitude can make teamwork difficult. On the other hand, these young people bear a huge burden of family responsibilities and expectations in a culture where respect and care for elders is an important virtue. So these independent young Chinese remain profoundly interdependent in a way that may be difficult for outsiders to understand. And this combination is important to understanding their behavior, for instance regarding consumer behavior and buying decisions. Therefore, it's often difficult to assess a given culture as either individualistic or collectivistic, as both ends of the spectrum may interact in a given cultural setting. Next come deal versus relationship-focused cultures, and the examples I'm about to give you here tell us that this value dimension is closely connected with the individualist and collectivist value dimensions. In deal-focused markets, you can usually get down to business after just a few minutes of small talk, and you can learn most of what you need to know about your potential deal-focused counterpart in a matter of days, rather than the weeks or months it may take in, say, South Korea or Greece. In deal-focused cultures, trust is expected to be built through rules and agreements, and larger social rules are expected to predominate over family and friendship obligations. Examples of deal-focused cultures are Scandinavia, Germanic and Anglo-Saxon countries, as well as Russia and Poland. In relationship-focused cultures, people find it important to build trust through relationships, and family and friendship obligations predominate over larger social rules. This is also the reason why nepotism, or for instance, employing a cousin, is acceptable in such cultures. Relationship-focused cultures may consider deal-focused cultures to be cold and too preoccupied with rules and agreements. At the same time, deal-focused cultures may find that relationship-focused cultures act very slowly, since they don't trust people they don't know and want to know more about them before they're ready to sign a contract. Examples of relationship-focused cultures would be parts of Asia, Southern Europe, as well as actually most of the world. This quotation goes like this: in some family-oriented cultures, relationship building is what facilitates business. But to us who have a more direct approach, it's difficult to behave correctly. I mean, we don't go golfing with a customer for 3 days to establish a relationship before doing business. This quotation, made by a Danish manager, demonstrates knowledge of what matters to relationship-focused cultures. But the problem is that she fails to use the knowledge to cooperate effectively with the customer. If this manager had acted on her cultural knowledge, she would have realized that it's worthwhile investing a couple of days together with a Japanese customer to develop trust and build a closer business relationship. Here we distinguish between low power distance, also known as egalitarian cultures, and high power distance or hierarchical cultures. Power distance is the extent to which differences in power and status are expected and accepted in a society. It reveals where the power lies and how it's structured. Cultures with a small power distance find it important to minimize inequalities among people, and they dislike when people display their status explicitly. This affects business life to a high extent, as in such cultures people prefer flat organizational structures, and business interaction and communication tend to be informal. Some examples of low power distance countries are Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon countries, the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and the power distance is a bit higher in Poland and France. In countries scoring high in power distance, such as Mexico and India, you find a greater centralization of power. People offer a great deal of formal respect to leaders. Titles and status are important, and you'll find many middle managers, and leaders and followers are unlikely to socialize together. Finally, subordinates are not expected to question their superiors. And examples of high power distance countries are South Korea, China, India, the Middle East, and parts of South America. It should be remembered that these value dimensions vary not only within national cultures, but also across other cultural contexts, including generations, professional cultures, and organizational cultures. When visiting a new organization, you may notice how people address their superiors, what kinds of titles are used, and how you are introduced to the senior manager. This may tell you something about what is expected from you. Next we have feminine or nurturing cultures as opposed to masculine or competitive cultures. This value dimension tells us to which degree masculine or feminine traits are valued and revealed in society. Cultures that value femininity stress nurturing behaviors, which includes, for instance, that the state provides for its citizens through a comprehensive welfare system. In these cultures there are overlapping gender roles, and cooperation, quality of life, and modesty are valued. Examples of feminine cultures are Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Thailand, South Korea, and Russia. Masculine cultures, however, display clear gender roles, and males are expected to be assertive, ambitious, and competitive. Examples of such cultures are Anglo-Saxon countries, Poland, most parts of Europe, parts of Latin America, as well as China and Japan. In business life, masculine cultures tend to view feminine values as weak, especially if employees from feminine cultures insist on focusing on the work-life balance instead of working long hours. On the other hand, feminine cultures may find business partners from masculine cultures to be very pushy and self-centered. This value dimension describes the extent to which people in a culture are at ease with the unknown. Cultures scoring low in uncertainty avoidance, such as Britain and Denmark, tend to feel at ease with unknown situations and what lies ahead. This also means that job mobility occurs more commonly than in high uncertainty cultures. Open-ended instructions, various ways of doing things, and loose deadlines are more typical in these kinds of cultures. And in general, people dislike laws and rules and regulations. Examples of low uncertainty avoidance cultures are Scandinavia, Great Britain, Canada, the USA, Vietnam, Hong Kong, China, and India. As opposed to that, cultures scoring higher in uncertainty avoidance are places where people are uncomfortable with ambiguity and risk and have little tolerance for the unknown. People living in such cultures seek to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity by means of rules and regulations. There is also a higher degree of loyalty towards the employer, and it's common to offer lifetime employment. For example, someone leading staff from high uncertainty avoidance countries like Greece, Japan, or France are expected to give clear instructions and timetables for when and how they want a work assignment completed. Simply telling an employee to write a plan in order to competently address the problem would create all kinds of dissonance for a team member oriented towards high uncertainty avoidance. Examples of high uncertainty avoidance cultures are Germany, Poland, Russia and Japan, and more moderately, the Netherlands and Australia. This value dimension describes our attitudes towards time. The Western world has a long history of defining success in the light of how much gets produced and consumed. As a result of that, Western industrialized cultures live by clock time. This means that punctuality and efficiency rule the day. People are concerned about not disturbing others or wasting time, and they follow rules of privacy. Examples of monochronic cultures are Nordic and Germanic Europe, North America, and Japan. In contrast, other cultures are far more interested in emphasizing the importance and obligation of social relationships. Events begin and end when all the participants feel the time is right, rather than artificially imposing clock time. In polychronic cultures, several business meetings may take place at the same time, and people do not mind interruptions during meetings. And you may take into consideration that if people are late for meetings, it may be because they're polychronic, not because they are disrespectful or lazy. For those coming from monochronic cultures, it's important to be willing to spend time building long-lasting relationships, and to create margin and flexibility in the schedule to give priority to people over plans. Examples of polychronic cultures are Poland, Southern Europe, Russia, China and South Korea, and very much so the Arab world, Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia. This value dimension distinguishes between having a direct, or what is also called a low-context communication style, or an indirect, or a so-called high-context communication style. A very important cultural difference in intercultural communication is the degree of directness when speaking. In a direct or low-context culture, people value sending and receiving accurate messages directly, using words and spelling out things explicitly. This also means that people belonging to this type of culture may find high-context cultures too vague, and that they don't trust them to tell the truth because of their indirect communication style. Examples of direct cultures are Scandinavia, Germany, Switzerland, North America, and to some extent Great Britain. In contrast, in indirect or high-context cultures, people often look for the meaning and understanding in what is not said, in body language, in silences and pauses, in relationships, etc. These cultures also focus on maintaining harmony and saving face. This is why they may see direct cultures as being confrontational, pushy and impolite. In indirect cultures such as Latin America, Korea and the Middle East, information is much more likely to be assumed and embedded within people rather than explicitly stated. This means that indirect cultures can be difficult to understand for an outsider, and that extra attention is needed. Examples of indirect cultures are Japan, China, South Korea, the Middle East, and, to some extent, Mediterranean cultures. Most national cultures across Europe and North America are categorized as direct cultures. Many of our connections with particular people and places are of a shorter duration, and therefore less is assumed. This means that individuals from indirect cultures, when dealing with direct individuals, should be attentive towards providing more explicit instructions than they would ordinarily do with a colleague from their own culture. As mentioned, many Western cultures appreciate direct communication, and we may ask ourselves why people coming from low-context cultures don't just tell things as they are. Does it mean that they're lying? Well, yes and no. In China, they might prefer to tell a white lie or to give an evasive answer to avoid making people upset or hurting their feelings, because it's important for both parties not to lose face. As this example shows, there are many ways of saying no in China. And therefore, when dealing with indirect cultures, it's important to keep asking open who, what, when, where questions to find out what is actually meant. What should also be remembered is that since close relationships matter in indirect cultures, you must make an effort to develop the relationship with your business partner, who will then feel more committed to giving you the true version of the story. This value dimension concerns the different ways that cultures choose to express emotions both verbally and non-verbally. Much of the success of communication relates to our body language and non-verbal gestures, not just to what we say. So to understand fully how people in any particular culture communicate, we must become familiar with their body language and other kinds of non-verbal behavior. This means that we must look for non-verbal cues to interpret the underlying communication. And as always, it's important also to be aware of what your own culture has taught you. In more reserved cultures, people believe that emotions should be held in check, so you don't give the appearance of being out of control. People prefer soft-spoken communication and hardly interrupt each other while speaking. They also make limited use of gestures and facial expressions. And during a conversation, people from reserved cultures feel most comfortable standing at least an arm's length from each other. Besides, in reserved cultures, people dislike intense direct eye contact, which may be interpreted as hostility. Examples of reserved cultures are East and Southeast Asia, the UK, Nordic and Germanic Europe. In expressive cultures, it's natural to express emotions openly. People speak loudly, interrupt each other, and use a lot of gestures and facial expressions. During the conversation, they feel comfortable standing quite close to each other and often touch. In these cultures, they make use of direct and even intense eye contact, which signals interest and sincerity. Examples of expressive cultures are Mediterranean countries, the Middle East and Latin America, and more moderately North America, Central and Eastern Europe, as well as South Asia. Please note that expressive cultures doing business with reserved cultures may find them cold and impersonal. So they should keep in mind that the lack of enthusiasm shown by reserved cultures is not necessarily caused by lack of interest, but simply because they find it inappropriate to show feelings. At the same time, reserved cultures doing business with people from expressive cultures may find that they are standing too close to them during a conversation, and they may want to step back, which the person coming from the expressive culture might find offending. Now that you've been introduced to some of the basic differences and similarities between cultures around the world, you need to consider yourself and, together with your colleagues, which of the issues do you need to pay particular attention to, given your own background, international experience, and the markets you operate in. Also discuss with colleagues how you can become more culturally competent. Where are your weaknesses and strengths? In the following 2 slides, you'll find some recommendations on how to plan for cross-cultural interactions. As mentioned, you need to gain knowledge of the culture in question. Remember that even though you may look up the cultural characteristics of a country, this information is only useful for building awareness and highlighting general contrasts, but it does not fully reflect the complex circumstances of a given cultural setting, including the complications introduced by the subculture of an organization or a team. Managers and subordinates with high cultural competence make use of their cultural understanding to develop a plan for new cross-cultural situations. These people are better able to monitor, analyze, and adjust their behaviors in different cultural settings. So setting a strategy means that you're able to form a link between your cultural understanding and the necessary behavior. Therefore, you need to become aware of what is going on around you, to move out of some of the automated ways we all do things in more familiar environments, to become more conscious and alert about your surroundings in order to develop an appropriate strategy for a new cultural situation. What do you then need to plan in order to do a cross-cultural assignment successfully? An example of an approach could be like this when you enter a company's office for the first time to discuss a business proposal. You may observe what's on the wall, the office setup, the way employees are dressed and the titles used for various positions, who gets invited to the meeting to discuss your proposal. These are all surface observations. While making those observations, you need to dig deeper and try to make some interpretations of what's going on. For instance, who are the ultimate decision makers for this project? What are the interests behind the parties sitting at the table? You also need to reflect on your expectations when meeting people from other cultures. In addition to what you need to ask yourself during a business meeting, you also need to make preparations before the meeting, and you may ask yourself, what kind of small talk is appropriate for a person from this culture and for this individual? Who should take the initiative to go from small talk into business? How will you get to action steps in the meeting? And how much direction should you provide? And of course, it's difficult to answer such questions without having cultural knowledge. The why strategy mentioned indicates that you should go deeper into the level of an issue. For instance, by asking, "We still don't have a contract from Japan, and why is that?" The answer might be because they wouldn't sign it before you left. But why? Is it because trust among Japanese managers takes a long time? But why is that then? And so on, and so on. To plan your cross-cultural interactions, you also need to check to see if your assumptions and plans were appropriate in the past and to adapt your strategy accordingly. As for knowledge sharing, you are recommended to keep a journal of your cross-cultural reflections to share with your colleagues and to discuss the insights together. Make sure to share knowledge among colleagues on a regular basis using best and worst case examples to develop best practice. Learning from role models is also beneficial. Find someone in your company who seems to be successful in interacting with other cultures. Ask to follow the person and for him or her to be your coach. Also make sure to discuss culture and intercultural communication in relation to the shared values and norms of the company. Finally, remember that we cannot possibly learn the individual preferences of all the people we encounter at our work. But learning the cultural norms and values of different groups of people helps us behave more effectively and respectfully. That's why intercultural competence is so important. Thank you for taking your time watching this cultural introduction, and please continue to Module 2.